At my husband's glittering company gala, I walked in expecting to celebrate our success, only to hear a woman behind me whisper, "That's the cold wife who can't keep him satisfied." Her voice sliced straight through the music and laughter, freezing me mid-step. Before I could turn, another voice, sharper, crueler, followed. "Poor thing has no idea he's trading her in. Vanessa practically runs the company now." My stomach twisted. I forced myself to keep walking, heels tapping against marble, smile glued on like armor. But every corner I passed held another pair of eyes waiting to judge me. When I reached the center of the ballroom, his mistress, yes, his mistress, brushed past in a red dress and sneered loud enough for everyone to hear, "Security, remove this useless woman." The guards hesitated, recognizing me as the co-owner of the firm, but one look from her made them step forward. My husband pretended not to see. I walked out on my own, silent, refusing to give them the satisfaction of breaking me. Before we continue, I want to thank you for being here to share stories of women reclaiming their power. If you believe that self-respect matters more than empty promises, please consider subscribing. It's free and helps us reach more women who need to hear this. Now, let's see how this unfolds. Outside the hotel, the cold night air met my skin like truth itself, sharp, honest, undeniable. I stood beneath the glowing entrance, realizing that humiliation wasn't the ending they thought it was. It was the beginning of clarity. For 23 years, I had supported Robert through every rise and every storm. I'd mortgaged my inheritance to fund his earliest investments, built relationships with clients who trusted me long before they trusted him, and reviewed contracts until dawn while he slept blissfully unaware of the work that protected his empire. Yet in that ballroom, among people whose careers I had helped shape, I was suddenly reduced to a joke. A disposable ornament. A burden to be replaced. It wasn't rage that filled me, it was an icy, calculated calm. I walked to my car, hands steady, mind sharper than it had ever been. By the time I reached home, a plan had already taken shape. I sat at my desk, fingers flying across the keyboard, logging into every financial portal we shared. First, I froze all joint checking accounts, all of them. Then I canceled his credit cards, the company travel accounts, and every luxury trip he'd booked with my money. Next came the real blow. I executed the sale of my $17 million stake in Sterling Enterprises. The confirmation email appeared with a quiet chime, final, irreversible. Robert might have humiliated me in front of a ballroom, but by morning, I would humiliate his entire empire. My phone buzzed relentlessly as I drove home, the screen lighting up every few seconds with another incoming call from Robert. His frantic persistence, first confusion, then irritation, then desperation, was almost poetic. I didn't answer a single one. Not because I wanted to punish him, but because I no longer felt obligated to soothe the panic of a man who had allowed my humiliation to become entertainment. When I pulled into our circular driveway, the house looked different. Not physically, but spiritually. It stood like a monument to years of sacrifice I had poured into a marriage that had treated me like a replaceable accessory. The moment I stepped into the foyer, something inside me shifted. This wasn't our home. This was the stage where I had played a supporting role in a script Robert wrote without me. The silence inside was heavy, but not suffocating. It felt expectant, like the moment before a storm breaks. I walked into the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water, and let my mind settle. My reflection in the window stared back, older, wiser, steadier. Not the shaken woman escorted out of a ballroom, but someone who had finally woken up. Robert had underestimated me for years, mistaking my loyalty for blindness, my kindness for weakness, and my silence for ignorance. But the truth was simple, I saw everything. I always had. I had just chosen love over confrontation, until he chose humiliation over respect. At sunrise, I went straight to my office. Files I had organized over decades lined the shelves, documents Robert never bothered to read or even acknowledge. The incorporation papers. The financial statements. The loan guarantees. Every signature. Every investment. Every risk. All meticulously recorded by me. I opened the first drawer and began scanning everything. If Robert wanted to erase my part in his success, then I would resurrect every receipt he had hoped time would bury. By 7 a.m., I'd created a digital archive detailed enough to rewrite the company's entire origin story. At 7:15, David, my financial advisor, called to confirm the liquidation of my shares. "Margaret, Sterling Enterprises stock is already slipping," he said, voice tight. "Word is circulating." A small smile touched my lips. "Good," I replied. "Let it fall." By 7:30, my phone exploded with new messages. The board wanted an emergency meeting. Investors demanded answers. And Robert had officially entered meltdown mode. His texts were frantic attempts at control. "We need to talk. You're overreacting. Undo the trades now. You're destroying everything." But the truth was, I wasn't destroying anything. I was exposing what had already rotted beneath the surface. Before leaving for the office, I walked through the house one more time. The dining table where I'd hosted dozens of dinners for Robert's clients. The living room where he'd practiced speeches I helped him write, speeches he later claimed were his own genius. The hallway filled with pictures of vacations I'd planned, paid for, and photographed. Every memory sharpened my resolve. Today, Robert would finally learn something he had forgotten long ago. You cannot discard a woman who built the ground you stand on. By the time I arrived at Sterling Enterprises for the emergency board meeting, the atmosphere in the building felt electric with tension. Employees whispered in tight clusters, their eyes widening slightly when they recognized me. For years, these halls had echoed with my silent contributions, late-night strategy sessions, confidential negotiations, and careful corrections to Robert's reckless decisions. Yet half the staff believed I was merely the wife who hosted dinners and smiled for photographs. Today, that illusion would shatter. I stepped into the boardroom 30 minutes early and laid out my documents with precise deliberation. These men had spent decades applauding Robert's leadership while conveniently ignoring the invisible architect beside him. Not today. One by one, the board members filed in, their expressions uneasy, perhaps sensing that the power structure they relied upon was about to shift dramatically. When Patricia from legal entered, her eyes flicked to the stack of paperwork in front of me, and I could almost see the moment she realized how thoroughly I'd prepared. She had underestimated me too, and like Robert, she was about to face the consequences of that mistake. The clock struck 9 just as Robert stormed into the room, desperation clouding his usually polished demeanor. His hair was unstyled, his tie crooked, his voice uneven as he demanded an explanation. This was the same man who had smiled coldly while his mistress ordered security to escort me out as though I were a trespasser. Now he stood trembling at the edge of the empire he believed he owned. Before he could launch into accusations, I opened the meeting with calm authority. As founding partner, I said evenly, I will begin with documentation of my contributions. The word struck the room like a thunderclap. Robert froze. Several board members shifted nervously. For over 20 years, no one had used the phrase, founding partner, in reference to me, because Robert had deliberately buried that truth under layers of revisionist corporate history. But the legal documents I spread across the table carried my maiden signature, my investments, my risks. No amount of denial could erase them now. Robert lunged forward, snatching at the papers, trying to dismiss them as symbolic gestures. But the board members leaned in, reading every highlighted section: loan guarantees, acquisition funding, strategic investments, even tax documentation signed solely by me. Evidence he never expected would resurface. His voice cracked as he insisted I was overreacting, unstable, emotional. The familiar tactics he had used to dismiss me privately were now floundering in a room full of witnesses. When Patricia finally cleared her throat, her words delivered the blow Robert feared. "Legally," she said carefully, "Mrs. Sterling's position is strong." The title Mrs. Sterling felt symbolic now, a name soon to be shed, but hearing her acknowledge my authority forced the truth into the open. Robert's panic grew visible. His pacing was frantic, his arguments unraveling. Vanessa, who had positioned herself at the back of the room, watched with widening eyes as she realized her assumptions about power were collapsing. She had believed proximity to Robert made her untouchable. She was learning, painfully, that I had been holding the real power all along. When Robert finally whispered, "What do you want?" the room fell silent. For the first time, he recognized the truth. The woman he tried to discard was the one capable of dismantling everything he built. What I wanted, in truth, wasn't vengeance. It was acknowledgement of the years I had poured into a partnership that Robert had rewritten as a solo triumph, of the sacrifices that had fueled his ascent while consuming my own ambitions. But looking into his desperate eyes, I realized something even more powerful: he would never understand the value of what he'd thrown away. So my answer needed to be something he could understand, power shifting out of his grasp. "What I want," I replied, keeping my voice steady, "is for my name to stand separate from yours. I want my contributions recognized legally, financially, and historically. This company will not continue to exist on the lie that you built it alone." The board members exchanged uneasy glances. It had always been easier to believe Robert was the mastermind behind Sterling Enterprises. Admitting the truth meant acknowledging how deeply they had underestimated me. Robert sank into his chair with a defeated exhale, but he wasn't finished grasping for control. "Margaret, please, we can work this out privately. Don't destroy the company over a misunderstanding." The plea would have been laughable if it weren't so predictable. Robert had always wanted privacy when it protected him. Public scrutiny, however, terrified him. His entire identity was built on the illusion of integrity and intelligence. The cracks in that image were widening faster than he could patch them. "This isn't destruction," I corrected. "This is correction." Patricia looked at me with something close to respect, maybe even admiration, as she quietly updated her notes. She wasn't used to seeing a woman reclaim financial authority so calmly, especially in a room where she'd watched men dismiss me for years. As I presented the next document, a complete breakdown of the financial discrepancies Robert had created during the past 5 years, gasps rippled through the room. He'd siphoned money into discretionary budgets, disguised personal expenses as company costs, and overextended corporate credit to maintain a lifestyle that projected success. Vanessa's face drained of color. She hadn't known. The affair had been glamorous only because I was unknowingly subsidizing it. I paused, letting the reality settle over the board. "This is what happens when you remove the person who kept the company stable," I said. Robert buried his face in his hands, the weight of his unraveling empire finally settling on his shoulders. For a moment I almost pitied him, almost. But pity couldn't survive the memory of being escorted out like a stranger, of hearing whispers calling me useless, of watching him glow with pride beside the woman he'd replaced me with. Slowly, deliberately, I gathered the remaining documents into a neat stack. "The next steps are simple," I said. "The company restructures without me. I take what is legally mine. And you, Robert, take responsibility for the choices that led us here." Silence followed, thick enough to feel. Even the city noise beyond the windows seemed to pause. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, Robert spoke the words that ended everything: "I'll resign." The board inhaled sharply. Vanessa swayed slightly, as though the room had tilted. And I, finally, fully, felt free. When I walked out of that boardroom, the echo of Robert's resignation still hanging in the air, it felt like stepping into sunlight after decades underground. The polished hallway outside seemed brighter, wider, almost unfamiliar, as if the building itself had shifted to acknowledge that something seismic had occurred inside its walls. For years, this place had been an extension of Robert's power, a monument to the narrative he'd crafted about himself. Now, for the first time, its foundation had been shaken by the simple truth: I had always been half the empire he claimed to have built alone. As I waited for the elevator, the executives who had once dismissed me as ornamental avoided my eyes, unsure whether to offer respect, apology, or fear. I didn't blame them. They'd never been taught to see me at all. When the elevator arrived, its doors sliding open with a soft chime, I stepped in and allowed myself a slow, controlled exhale, a release of 23 years of silence and accommodation. The doors closed, sealing me in a quiet gold-lit box that carried me away from the remnants of a life I'd outgrown. My reflection in the mirrored panel caught my attention, my posture straighter, my expression calmer, my presence more certain. I didn't look like the woman escorted out of that gala humiliated and heartbroken. I looked like someone who had reclaimed her name, her legacy, and her autonomy. The elevator descended floor by floor, and with each soft ding, I felt another layer of my old identity peeling away. By the time the doors opened into the parking garage, I was no longer the supporting character in Robert's story. I was the author of my own. The air in the garage was cool, echoing faint footsteps and distant engines, but it felt strangely peaceful. My car sat where I'd left it, waiting like a loyal companion. I unlocked it, placing my folder of documents carefully on the passenger seat, evidence of a war I had already won. But instead of driving home immediately, I remained still for a moment, hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, absorbing the enormity of what had just happened. Freedom, I realized, wasn't loud or explosive. It was quiet, steady, a pulse that moved through your body when you finally stopped begging to be seen and chose instead to step into your own light. When I finally started the engine, my phone vibrated with another cascade of missed calls. Robert again. But there was something different now, something final in the way I ignored his name glowing across the screen. His panic no longer had the power to dictate my emotions. His crisis was no longer my responsibility to fix. As the garage began to blur behind me, I understood with absolute clarity that the life waiting ahead would not be built on compromise or invisibility. It would be built on truth, my truth, and the strength I discovered in myself when everything else had fallen apart. I drove away without looking back. Not because I didn't care, but because there was nothing left in that world worth returning to. The weeks that followed unfolded like stepping into a new version of my life, one that had always been waiting beneath the surface, patient and unwavering. Each morning, I woke not to Robert's needs or his schedule, but to my own quiet ambitions stretching their limbs after years of confinement. My home, once a museum of expectations and performance, gradually transformed into a sanctuary of authenticity. I replaced the sterile abstract canvases Robert preferred with photographs I'd taken on morning walks, sunrise spilling over the ocean, weathered hands of a gardener tending roses, a laughing child chasing pigeons across a plaza. My days were no longer dictated by corporate events or investor dinners. Instead, they were filled with art classes, business meetings for ventures I believed in, and long reflective hours rediscovering the woman I had been before marriage had compressed her into a supporting role. The silence that once felt suffocating now soothed me, a reminder that peace was not the absence of noise but the presence of self. As my photography gained recognition, invitations began arriving, gallery showcases, collaborative projects, feature articles. For the first time, I wasn't standing beside someone who was admired. I was the one being applauded. People valued my perspective, respected my insights, and sought my opinion without needing Robert's approval to validate them. It was liberating, intoxicating even, to realize how much of my brilliance had gone unused simply because I'd been too loyal to a man who believed spotlights belonged only to him. Hartford Ventures, the investment firm I created, flourished as well. Entrepreneurs found comfort in my honesty, strength in my guidance, and hope in my belief that rebuilding was not only possible but powerful. I poured into them what I had once poured into my marriage: strategy, intuition, dedication. But this time, I received returns instead of erasure. As months passed, my sister Sarah and I rebuilt our relationship on new terms, ones not centered on Robert's accomplishments or crises. Elena became a trusted mentor and friend, challenging me to push deeper into my artistic instincts. Even strangers, like the young woman who'd approached me at my exhibition, became reminders that transformation is contagious. When one woman frees herself, she unwittingly lights the path for others. And though there were moments of grief, small, fleeting aches when I passed a familiar restaurant or heard a song we once slow danced to, they never lingered. They were ghosts, not anchors. The day my divorce was finalized, I didn't cry. I didn't celebrate either. Instead, I simply stood on the balcony of my new home overlooking the ocean and breathed. Deeply, fully, without fear. I realized that closure wasn't a dramatic ending, it was a quiet reclaiming of space inside yourself. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and amber, I understood that I had finally become the woman I was meant to be. Not Mrs. Sterling. Not the invisible partner. Just Margaret, whole, capable, and profoundly free. If this story of earned justice had you hooked from beginning to end, hit that like button right now. My favorite part was when Margaret calmly told the boardroom she was taking back what she built, watching Robert's empire crumble. What was your favorite moment? Drop it in the comments below. Don't miss more empowering stories like this. Subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload.